There's a fear unique to zombies, vampires, and other such creatures, a level of terror that arguably can be surpassed, but never quite equaled. Lovecraftian terror can show us what is beyond what we can possibly believe and imagine, and a jump scare is always an easy way to get someone's heart racing, but there's something to be said about a horde of beings that you can stab, shoot, and more, but still they keep on going. No matter how hard you try, you can't truly kill them. No matter how hard you fight, the threat will never dissipate. Never be defeated, never be truly slain. All you can do is hold the line and push back this wave, for there will always be the next one. Zombies are my favorite horror monster, and vampires of course need no introduction. But some madman at Games Workshop one day had an idea. What if the zombies were led by vampires? And whoever that soul was, they were cooking up perhaps the greatest idea in all of Warhammer. Because in the worlds of Warhammer, death is usually seen as a mercy. But amongst the forces of Sylvania and the vampires beyond it, death is just another step in the endless servitude you owe your undying masters. So tell me, do you want to control the beings that go bump in the night? Do you read Warhammer lore and wish you could show those posers in the realm of chaos who exactly the true master of the world is? Do you have a fundamental need to play a necromancer build in any game it's possible to do so in? Well then, it's a good thing the night is still young, because we'll be seeing if the vampire counts or the old world army for you. But before I begin, are you a bit hungry by chance? Well, if so, allow me to introduce you to Factor, the sponsor of this video. Factor is the premier meal delivery service, sending chef-crafted and dietitian-approved meals straight to your front door. No hassle, no grocery store trips, the food just shows up right at your place. No prep work or cleaning up either, just 2 minutes in the microwave, and when it's done, you got yourself a fine meal ready to eat. While I can just about cook without setting my house on fire, I've never enjoyed doing it, and if you're like me, Factor's a great way to actually have food without having to cook or order out for the 4th time in a week. And with real ingredients, balanced macros, and at least 2 veggies per meal, you're eating quality food. Since I have been fighting for my life to have an almost normal sleeping schedule, I've been having Factor meals a lot more around noon than my typical habits of eating for the first time at 10 p.m. They're still just as good when the sun is out as when it's the middle of the night, thankfully, and it's a nice way to get some food in me before going about my day. And to get yourself some fine Factor meals, look no further. Head to Factor75.com or click the link below and use code PancreasFB50 to get 50% off your first Factor box plus free breakfast for 1 year. That's code PancreasFB50 at Factor75.com to get 50% off plus free breakfast for 1 year. PancreasFB50 at Factor75.com. Offer only valid for new Factor customers with code and qualifying auto-renewing subscription purchase. Everyone's gotta eat, so why not get Factor to get yourself some quick, easy, and well-made food today. Now then, such is the power of Nagash that even in a video not about him, he's still relevant. The vampire counts, as you can likely guess from the opening there, have their origins within the lands of Nehekara. To make a quite long story short, there once was a man named Nagash. He sucked. He was a petty, jealous asshole. One day some dark elves were captured by his people and slated for sacrifice. He whisked them away under false pretenses, learned the secrets of dark magic from them, and became the first necromancer. His findings were soon spread out across the land as he needed more lieutenants, though the full extent of his knowledge never left his mind as he was a man who wouldn't let anyone upstage him. He was eventually defeated, but not before he got the entire region of Nehekara killed and then brought back to one life. This is how we have the Tomb Kings, the true neutral undead. More pressingly, however, is that before all that nasty business, a couple people tried to copy his notes. From these attempts came an imperfect version of his already monstrous elixir of life, which granted those who took it not perfect immortality, but vampirism. In the city of Lamia did vampirism arise, and from there did it spread. After Nagash's various defeats, the vampires spread outward, each with their own purpose. Some were noble, some were anything but, and though they all had different desires and wants, all of them had the same fundamental need, to drink the blood of the living to survive. Classic vampire stuff, but the twist here is that vampirism gives you fundamental knowledge of necromancy in Warhammer, so wherever the bloodsuckers went, so too did the endless hordes of zombies. Some of these vampires were also awful people. Neferata is not a good person, no matter what her Simpson handmaidens might say. Others were pretty average. Abharash is happy to fight people to the death, but in more of a noble warrior sort of way. I won't say he's the best of people out there, but especially in Warhammer, he ain't a bad guy either. Others such as Usharan, in spite of looking like this, were decent folk who generally wanted the best for people. But for the story of the vampire counts as a faction, though all of these different vampires did play their part, there is one being who is more pivotal than any other. He's gone by many names, in part because GW apparently gets off on retconning and re-retconning and unre-retconning in the vampire origins of Warhammer Fantasy, but his final and most important name would send shivers down the spines of all who heard it. This being, this vampire above all others, was none other than a man named Vlad von Carstein. Vlad was a well-traveled vampire. He originated in Nehekara when there were still living people there, and that was indeed where he became one. He'd gone to Cathay and advised those there, he was a pirate for a while, and eventually he made his way to the imperial province of Sylvania thousands of years later. Quite old by this point, he decided, for potentially many reasons, be it wanting a solid power base to fight off other vampires with, or just because he could, that he'd try his hand at nobility once again. Even before he showed up to the province of Sylvania, it sucked. The second worst province in the Empire by far, only beaten out by literally anywhere in Stirland, it was a realm of dark mist, monsters everywhere, and necromancers somehow outnumbering the monsters. It was ruled by a man named Otto van Drack, who had almost zero redeemable qualities, was at least a bit insane, and worked his people to the bone. Usually his underlings ignored him, but they were almost as big of assholes as he was, so in practice the peasantry of Sylvania were never winning. The only thing Otto had going for him was that he at least kind of cared for his daughter Isabella, and before he died he wanted to make sure she married someone worthy of her. Unfortunately, Otto's brother wanted to get some good Habsburg fun going on with his niece, and the only guy Otto thought might make a good husband killed himself, and everyone outside Sylvania wanted nothing to do with the freak show that was the people within the region and refused her hand in marriage. Well, enter stage left Vlad von Carstein. He figured marrying into power was as efficient a route as any, and with no other options left, Otto van Drack agreed and married the two of them minutes before he died. It was a dark and stormy night this all happened on, incidentally, because when we're discussing vampires, that just happens. Our newlywed vampire's first act, meanwhile, was to rip out Isabella's creepy uncle's heart and throw him off a tower, as well as secure the loyalty of the rest of the nobility. No one liked him at first, but Vlad's a cool guy, so he won them over. After that, it was on to ruling. Initially, he and Isabella were just married for convenience. Vlad wanted power, and Isabella wanted to not be married to her uncle. They didn't hate each other, but they weren't too into it. But over time, their relationship did turn into genuine love, and the two became as close as can be. Sometimes Vlad would descend into a murderous rage, and Isabella was the only one able to calm him down. It was very cute in a horrific gothic vampire kind of way. Better yet, the previous rulers of Sylvania were so horrendous at everything that under the rule of what is still ultimately a tyrannical vampire couple, things got noticeably better for everyone in the province. It sucked that bad. Saying it prospered might be an overstatement, but it didn't nearly suck as bad. Still, this sort of thing couldn't last. Undeath in the Empire of Man is arguably seen as equally bad as chaos, and eventually an old woman realized that the two rulers of the province looked identical to when she was a toddler. This revelation would spread like wildfire, but it was too late. Vlad by this point, aside from admittedly improving Sylvania's standing, had also been marshalling a massive army of the undead, from zombies to skeletons to other vampires. He waged war on the Empire and nearly brought it to his knees, intent on claiming the imperial throne for himself, since who better to lead than a wise and undying being such as himself? The First Vampire War saw the Empire ravaged, not helped by the fact that the entire thing happened during the era where the Empire was split into various bickering factions all fighting for the throne of Emperor. Though Vlad was ultimately defeated and the vampires pushed back, the damage wrought by this conflict was severe. Aside from the obvious loss of life that comes with hundreds of thousands if not millions of zombies pushing across the land, the taint of necromancy and vampirism was spread across the Empire as more and more of those types were created for the war. The vampires' momentum was stopped and they would enter a period of infighting, true, but now such dark arts were far more widespread than they ever had been in Sigmar's realm. At the time of the Old World, the vampire accounts do largely lie dormant, as you could likely guess if you're aware that they are unfortunately a legacy army. Manfred von Carstein is traveling the world for the books of Nagash and other sources of necromantic power, and his brother Conrad von Carstein is being a character named Conrad in Warhammer. He spent this era turning people into skin coats and then getting himself killed because he kept turning people into skin coats. I'm also breezing past a whole other vampire war as well, which was another moment the Empire had to lock in to not be eaten alive. But though the grandest of the vampire counts are sleeping, do remember what I said. The amount of undead and necromancers is spread like wildfire, perfect for the seeds of future conquest to grow from. While the Empire is busy fighting amongst itself and soon enough will have to contend with the threat of another Everchosen, the undead have been left to the wayside. They, and if you take this army you, will have all the time in the world to gather their strength and remind everyone that in Warhammer Fantasy, it's the undead who are the rightful rulers of the world. And not the ancient and decrepit Tomb Kings to the south, but the true and rightful rulers of the Empire and beyond. The time to usher in everlasting night has arrived, and the midnight aristocracy is poised to set up all they need to rule over the cattle that deems them oh so unnatural. So get your finest of wine cups ready and prepare to fill them with the blood of your enemies, because the vampire counts are here and ready to make it everyone's problem. The Vampire Counts are an army that does villainy, but also potentially heroism quite well, in a way that few Warhammer armies can, even amongst fantasy. Starting with the villainy, because let's be honest, that's great fun. They are the vampiric masters of all who are the undead that seek to bring about an everlasting night. They will grind the living under their heels until they're naught but cattle, and they wield great and terrible dark magic as well as unrivaled martial might. They are the masters of all that goes bump in the night, and with those forces they'll bring the world to its knees. And come on now, tell me what I just described doesn't strike you as at least a little bit awesome. How often are the endless hordes of undead playable by ya? I mean, I guess that kind of thing is becoming more common, but with the vampire counts, you don't have to work for it. You're a badass necromancer out the gate. That's true even if you don't run a lot of necromancers, since vampires are all at least passingly proficient in the subject. Quite frankly, if you want a grand scope villain that isn't chaos, the vampire counts are the best option ever made. The orcs, for example, always strike me as more of a random threat that just happens every now and again. They can cause a whole lot of damage, see Grom, but they don't really have plans beyond smash things. The smartest orc that ever existed, Azag the Slaughterer, was only smart because he put on a necromantic crown belonging to Nagash. They're like the most jovially violent natural disaster ever. Ogres don't really have grand designs, and the Skaven sure as hell do, but they're the Skaven. They can't work together long enough for their schemes to work, with the exception of the event where GW wanted the setting dead so badly they let the Skaven join Chaos. But the vampire counts. Oh no, these bad boys are threats. They threaten the living, they threaten chaos, they threaten each other. When a vampire starts raising a stink, the Empire's version of the DEFCON level has to be readjusted, because even a shitty weak vampire is only shitty and weak by vampire status. Their ultimate goal would see the living under their boots and chaos removed from the world, if not potentially outright destroyed depending on the vampire in question and what their endgame is. But that said, if you try, you can have genuinely morally good vampires. The thing about becoming a vampire in Warhammer is that while it does to some extent exaggerate your personality, it doesn't actually change anything you do. True, you do need to now drink blood, which naturally means you'll be at odds with people who quite like their blood, but there are ways around it. Find willing people and your vampire can live their life without killing anyone. True, necromancy is an inherently evil magic in this setting that draws on what's basically a step above pure chaos magic to work, but being undead helps prevent a lot of the issues that mortal necromancers face, so maybe it won't corrupt you. It's your army, man. Write the lore however you want, and if you want a lawful good vampire, it's theoretically possible for the vampire counts. If you do go that route though, maybe try not to raise someone's grandma from the dead in front of them. Bit of a social faux pas, that. As I'd say is expected from an army based around the idea of necromancy, they're also perfect for any level of battle for literally any other characters. Maybe a vampire has raised a small force of whatever random undead he could, for any reason between he's a newly forged one who hasn't got much experience, or because he's in a bad spot and low on resources. Or for a 500-point game, you got a schmuck necromancer, who's a schmuck necromancer, so all he has is 500 points of zombies to work with. For medium-sized games, a more prominent but still only moderately powerful vampire can make the beginning of their play to get some real power, bringing forth all the undead he can muster, as well as some ghouls and whatever monsters are drawn to his presence and will. And for the largest of games, Lords of the Undead of unparalleled might bring forth an entire season of The Walking Dead's worth of zombies and skeletons, all bolstered by dozens of necromancers keeping the horde going and lesser vampires executing the orders of their master. It's a sight to behold one way or another, and you have all the narrative options you could want for every level of play with a vampire counts. Beyond that, there's also a lot of customization for your characters, though there's a bit of a sticking point with them in the old world that'll come back to later. But since Vampire the Masquerade was popular, and no, I won't be researching further into that subject to see who really ripped off who, the vampires all have different bloodlines, each giving them different powers, abilities, and oftentimes personality traits, though some of that last one is likely enforced by pre-existing vampires of a given bloodline. Necrocs, for instance, are some of the strongest mages around, whilst the Lamians are sneaky vampire Illuminati with webs of influence across damn near every faction in the game. Strigoi are bestial animals that have lost damn near everything, Blood Dragons are some of the mightiest warriors around, and the von Carsteins are the vampirest vampires to ever vampire. With the different options for building a character, if you don't mind getting minimally creative with a model, you can make whatever bloodline you want to lead your force. Combine this with the above fact that they can be good or evil, and basically any idea you can think of for leading your force is valid. You can have a valiant blood dragon that's, let's say, lawful evil, crusading across the land fighting any worthy opponent they find. A Lamian Sisterhood vampire only deploying her army after she's forced to go loud for her evil schemes is perfect, since that's just about the only reason they openly fight anyways. Hell, make a Necrarch who's genuinely convinced their mad science magic research is for the good of all. You think the Flesh Eater courts have a monopoly on insanity? You can go even crazier once you get into deeper specifics too. Gotrek and Felix, because it's the baseline for learning about fantasy lore, and I've no shame referencing it every chance I get, has a few paragraphs in one book where a vampire is discussing how vampires work with Ulrika, who was soon to become a vampire. Spoiler alert on that one, I guess, but once you're a legendary character in Total Warhammer, it's fair to discuss, I say. A vampire that doesn't die in the sun and is only stunned by holy symbols is entirely possible in Warhammer because some of them are built like that. So is one that melts if someone holds a broken symbol of Sigmar in their face and the slightest hints of dawn makes them explode. You have room to get creative with your homebrew lore and then some with the vampire counts. And while it's probably taken way too long in a video about a horror movie monsters to mention this, if you like that sort of thing, this is the army for you. Vampire counts are obviously vampires, hope I'm not shocking you with that, and their foot soldiers are zombies and skeletons. 3 classics covered right there. But there's all sorts of monsters in their roster as well. Banshees and other ghosts, giant hulking brutish ghouls, regular ghouls. Hell, you can have normal people working alongside them as well, given that the purest form of the vampire counts in Sylvania work alongside mortal thralls pretty regularly. If it's scary, the vampire counts can throw it at you. They're relatedly one of the more fantastical armies, but one that manages to blend just a little bit of realism in with them. The fantastical stuff is obvious. Vampires, ghouls, undead dragons, we all like that kind of stuff, so if you want a fantasy army to feel fantastical, there's no better option. But again, those peasants under them are just normal people, trying to live their life in a way not too dissimilar from those of other imperial peasants, even though the specifics are obviously quite different given they serve undead lords. The vampires themselves wore outdated fashion from centuries ago, speaking accents that haven't been around for just as long. They're a fantastical army and that's great, but a fantastical army where a good amount of thought has been given to how that would look in a world as fleshed out as Warhammer Fantasy is. What the average vampire looks, sounds, and acts like is something that can very easily be discovered reading the lore. If you want an important faction, they're also one of the most influential ones as well. Sounds a bit whack to say an important faction, especially for a legacy one, but hear me out. A lot of factions in Warhammer, in the grand scheme of things, aren't too important, and that's across all the settings. Ogres in Fantasy and AOS have always struck me as random encounters for whoever's fighting them. At most, they're mercenaries for people with grander plans. The Tau over in 40k's whole shtick is being the up-and-coming new kid on the block that are still in the grand scheme of things a middling power at most, with the entirety of the Empire put together only having the projection power of a few craft worlds at most. And Genestealer cults are of course tiered dessert for after the fighting is done. There's nothing wrong with any of this. Quite frankly, I'd wager there's something to be said for playing an army that isn't narratively responsible for massive changes to the setting that more often than not fall flat. But the vampire counts are the type of folk that when they move in force, the entire world needs to take notice of. Even if a given vampire is tactically inept in all ways, a complete and utter idiot, it doesn't matter, because whoa, 1 million skeletons upon ye. And taking it to the logical extreme, the end times, though started by Archaon, did not narratively open with him, strictly speaking. They opened with the Gash and all the undead, which includes vampires, nearly hijacking the entire event for themselves and thwarting Chaos before it got anywhere. Chaos fears the undead. The thing about undeath and fantasy is that it sticks 2 big middle fingers at both the laws of the immaterial and material. It's magic, so of course natural science and logic are only so effective against it, but it's also a very ordered and structured magic in a lot of ways, so it inherently counteracts Chaos's madness as well. There's nothing in Warhammer, and I truly mean nothing, not even Necron technology, as effective at punking Chaos as a vampire with a chip on their shoulder. So if you want to be the threat that makes the other big boys quake in their boots whenever you show up, it's these guys. And for our last point jumping off of that is that this is an old world faction that at least personally, I don't mind is historically in a low point, and indeed one whose low points aren't all that low. For some context, Chaos waxes and wanes in Warhammer Fantasy especially. When an Everchosen arises, as one is in the old world, raids are everywhere and the hordes of the Everchosen are going to be burning down substantial chunks of the world. Sometimes they even make it to Ulthuan and the High Elves. But then they're defeated, and Chaos wanes and doesn't really do anything for a while. Raids into Nordland, for they're almost always into Nordland, drop to like 3 guys showing up once a month. Even the cults go quiet. Both the vampire counts, it's constant dynamic scheming and plotting, which is funny to me because the undead are some of the most active and proactive factions there are. When they're on the back foot, they immediately jump back into scheming and politicking and making sure they're ready for round 2. They're undead. Killing them and putting them down permanently is quite hard, as it turns out. Your vampire lord isn't spending the post-Vampire Wars era sitting there with their thumb up their ass. There's countless different things that they're getting up to. So if you're a real go-getter, this is the army to go with. Army stuff first as always. Cleaving Blow is part of how vampires kill people real good. If a model has this rule, any 6s they roll on a 2 wound roll don't allow armor or regeneration saves. Ward saves are still allowed, but that's hardly making this ability less powerful, especially if you're fighting weaker characters. Also, the rule can't be used if the attack automatically wounds, but in that case you've automatically wounded, so who cares? Dark Vitality lets your vampires and necromancers ignore the death of a general rule, which is the rule that means all your army starts falling apart if your general dies. Indomitable means that the unstable rule that can cause you to lose models if you lose a combat result is lowered by whatever value. It doesn't stack, keep in mind, so if something has Indomitable 2 and something else nearby has Indomitable 1, the unit it just has Indomitable 2, not 3. And Necromantic Undead is just the standard undead rule. You can't march a unit unless it has the fly keyword, and they all have fear, immune to psychology, unbreakable, and the unstable rule if they have this keyword, as was mentioned earlier. The newly dead rule is how you make people greatly upset, because it means you can bring a model above its starting strength. You can't bring it up to above maximum unit size, but if you bring yourself a small unit of zombies or something, you can dump resurrection spells into it to get yourself some free models. Wailing Dirge gives you something to do during the shooting phase, which lets models with this rule yell so loudly at an enemy unit within 8 inches of a model with this keyword that they have to take a leadership test based on their own leadership at -2. If they fail, they take as many wounds as they failed the test by, with only ward saves allowed. It gives them not great shooting, but something that can potentially soften an enemy up pretty nicely. It can even target enemy characters specifically, with the rule specifically stating that it ignores the usual targeting rules for lone characters. Nice and dangerous. There's also Resurrecting the Fallen, which is more of a guideline for how healing and resurrecting works. You can't outright bring back a destroyed character, but aside from that, here's how it goes. Characters that join the unit are healed first, then models with more than 1 wound are healed, then unit champions, standard bearers, and musicians are resurrected since those aren't characters, and finally, you start bringing back the rank and file. So with all that out of the way, let's get onto their spell game. They have the Lore of Undeath, with 3 pretty alright spells. Hellish Vigor gives a unit reserve move, and if the spell roll is 10 or higher, it's all units within the caster's command range. Van Hell's Dance Macabre gives +1 D3 to a unit's movement, weapon skill, or initiative, and on a 12 up, that D3 affects 2 of those stats. Then Raise Dead, which I'd say is the staple since it gets you more undead to throw at people. Casting value at 10, and you get 2 D3 zombies to plop down near your caster for pulling it off. Simple, but it's one of the easiest ways to tie someone up, even if only for a round, since they are still just zombies. Now then, we're going to start with heroes. In my video for the Warriors of Chaos, I said that their characters are the strongest ones around. I didn't technically lie, but I didn't tell the truth either. The Warrior of Chaos's characters are the strongest in the game, if you aren't counting legacy armies like the vampire counts. These characters, if you aren't counting named ones like goddamn Yao Ying, are arguably the strongest ones in the game, and even if Chaos and Dragons are stronger, those 2 armies are going to still at least need to think twice before sending their lords into the fray with yours. Vampires are melee monsters. A proper count has, among other things, 3 wounds a pop, 7 weapon skill, 5 strength, 5 toughness, 6 initiative, and 4 attacks. The Vampiric Thrall Lesser version is still quite capable of killing characters, and for less than half the points at only 75 compared to the count's 160 is damn good. Customizing them is also easy as can be, and is how you flavor all the different vampire bloodlines as part of your army for your lord. There's of course the simple things about taking armor and weapons, and in order for one to be a wizard you do have to pay for it, but the real juice comes from vampiric powers. Vampiric powers combined with their arcane items are how you make a true monster. Vampire counts get 100 points of them to equip, and Thrall's only 50, but what you get is powerful and indeed how you customize them for bloodlines. Take Beguile, for instance, for a Lamian vampire, which also, if that works, you're the most annoying bastard to hit with that rule. For 50 points, you can just get another wound, which seems slightly overcosted, but also fantasy has wounds mean a lot more than 8 OS or 40k, so fair enough. Dark Acolyte gives you the invocation of the Hex spell, which heals and resurrects models and is casted as a level 1 wizard with this power. The best I'd say is arguably the Master of the Black Arts rule, which raises a wizard's level by 1. This is how you get yourself a level 3 vampire wizard to cast all sorts of nonsense at people with. Each of these powers can only be taken once per army, but they are potent. The items, meanwhile, are also nonsense in the best way. 2 of their weapons have the Killing Blow special rule, and one either reduces an enemy's initiative by 1 permanently, assuming you don't kill them outright with it, and one has Killing Blow proc on a 5 and 6 wound roll instead of just a 6. Another is just I von Carstein's sword that heals a vampire a wound if they cause at least 1 during combat, and another is a lance that just kills people. That's it. It's just really good at erasing whatever the wielder charged at from existence, especially since you can reroll missed hit rolls with it. For the rest of their items, you get stuff like heavy armor that can be worn by wizards and gives you a 6-up ward save, or full plate armor that gives +1 to toughness but -1 to weapon skill and initiative. You can make a pure tank, a melee monster, whatever you desire. Or the magic banner that lets the unit it's in always hit on 3 ups. That one seems especially crazy to be, given a lot of your units do have low initiative and weapon skills. You can also mount your vampire lords on a variety of things, such as a nightmare, which is an undead horse, a coven throne, which can let you reroll hit rolls with a spell and also has a bunch of nonsense random schlubs attached to it to hit things with, or a zombie dragon / abyssal terror. To avoid getting too much into the specifics here, those are as deadly as the words zombie dragon imply. Strigoi Ghoul Kings, meanwhile, can be mounted on a terrorgeist for that sweet, sweet murderous monster underneath your already quite murderous monster, but otherwise otherwise they're your monstrous vampire option. They've got a few unique rules, including their hunger rule, which means they only roll a d6 to pursue fleeing enemies since they're too busy eating corpses, but whenever you manage to wound something with them, you roll a d6, and on a 6 you get a free wound back. It's a worse version of the blade that does the same thing, but you don't need to pay for it here, so they can be worth it. Beyond that, they're pretty murderous in melee, as all vampires are, and can still be a level 2 wizard, or 3 if you put that vampiric power on them. Cairn Wraiths are a simple hero choice. They don't have a lot of attacks, they don't have a lot of health, their other stats are only alright. But for 50 points, you get a unit that is ethereal, which means if your opponent doesn't have magical weapons, they just can't wound them. Either block an enemy unit that doesn't have any for the entire game, or throw them at an enemy character that doesn't have a magical weapon, and watch as they realize they're facing a unit they can't hurt that can deal up to 6 damage in a game where that kills characters pretty effectively. Wights are skeletal heroes that, while not quite as strong as vampires, can still give anything short of a Chaos Lord some serious trouble. Coming in the King and weaker Lord varieties, they can be kitted out with a variety of powerful weapons and banners, including the one mentioned earlier where they and their unit always hit on 3s. A bit less flashy than vampires, I'd still say you can't go wrong throwing them at someone. Tomb Banshees are similar to Cairn Wraiths, but have that wailing dirge scream to really annoy whoever you're throwing them at. I'd find little to say on them, though since they're also ethereal, they can double as snipers, since ethereal does mean units can go through terrain pieces and ignore all penalties for moving across rough terrain. And last for characters, we have necromancers. Fun fact, you don't need to have a vampire in your Vampire Count's army. I really think you should because it's in the goddamn name, but you don't, strictly speaking, need to, as far as I'm aware. And fair's fair, it's always the best option to play if it's available to you in a game, so I do still respect the guy who's purely mortal and went, nah, I don't need friends when I can raise all the ones I want from the local graveyard. These are the heroes you're going to have a lot of, since they all have Indomitable and will therefore mitigate you being undead. They also come in the Master Necromancer flavor, level 3 wizards that can upgrade to level 4, or Apprentice Necromancer, level 1 wizards that can upgrade to level 2. All of them have the Invocation of the Hex spell by default, so with enough of them you'll never run out of healing and resurrection for your army. Only one Master Necromancer per 1,000 points, true, and in smaller games this does mean you have to choose between them or a Vampire Count proper, but for all the healing and spellcasting they get, they're a valid alternate choice, and at a 2k point game you can happily take one of each. For the Apprentices, meanwhile, and the Vampire Thralls while I'm at it, you can take as many of them as you want, up to 50% of your points that you can spend on characters for your army. Spam Necromancers. I'm telling you to spam Necromancers, at least assuming you have a lot of hordes of weaker units. And while you're at it, put your Master Necromancer on a Mortis engine. Add +1 to the casting rolls of your level 4 wizard, because why not? Yeah, it does other things, and yeah, this also affects enemy wizards near it, and yeah, if you miscast, you roll twice on the table and eat both results, but I don't care about that. Magic go burr. As a forewarning of what's to come, if you're familiar with how undead armies work in Warhammer, you can probably guess why I spent so much of this video on their characters, but more on that in the cons section. For now, the rest of the army. TLDR, if you're one of those people who's here solely for the lore and not just background noise, the Vampire Counts have good stuff on almost every field. Your basic zombies and skeletons, they're shit. They're so unbelievably shit. I won't waste time on the stats because they're simply bad, just take my word for it. But zombies are 3 points a model and have newly dead, so you can keep pumping numbers into them, and skeletons are 5 points a model for chaff with light armor and shields if you have an enemy that also has a lot of chaff but no AP. They're so unfathomably cheap and easy to spam on the board that even if you kit out your Vampire Lord to hell and back, you can still swamp the field with garbage until your opponent can't move 3 feet without tripping over another horde. You don't run them because they're good units. You run them because you have so many bad units that your opponent physically can't move across the board, and your actual quality models can run roughshod over everyone else. Past them, though, we get to the actually interesting stuff. Crypt Ghouls are some of your quote-unquote elite infantry. They aren't great, and for 9 points a model you're paying almost double the skeletons or triple zombies for an infantry unit that still isn't pure stat-wise phenomenal. But they've got a regen save and are still undead, even though technically in lore they aren't quite, so they aren't a totally wasted pick. Graveguard, meanwhile, are 11 points a model, a bit pricier to be sure, but can actually stick around thanks to their heavy armor and shields even before you start resurrecting them. Plus, they can choose to not give ground if they lose a combat in the results. Since you can easily resurrect them still, this is how you ensure a given area of the board is absolutely not being given up to the enemy if you can get them there in time, or that potentially even something like Chaos Warrior still has to spend a few rounds chipping through them. And beyond those basics, the world is your oyster. Blood Knights are how you commit a drive-by lancing, especially given how you can easily give them full plate armor for fairly cheap. There's also Black Knights if you're strapped for points, I guess, and also you think Vampire Knights aren't the coolest thing ever, and it isn't worth sacrificing like a single unit of ghouls or something to get Vampire Knights because you're lame and boring, and you probably covered your hands in glue and then peeled it off in grade school, you fucking inbred. Hex Wraiths are expensive for a generic unit, but they're an entire unit with Ethereal. Go be problematic for people. It's funny. Crypt Horrors are your standard big monster guy to hit people with, while Vargheists are them, but better and can fly in exchange for being more expensive. It's 61 points per model compared to the Crypt Horror's 46. You've got undead wolves and bats to throw at people who bother you if you need something to be speedy. You've got a few different kinds of swarms, including the Ethereal Spirit Host if you want to ensure anyone who plays against you without magic attacks will not leave the table without wanting to punch your teeth in. Genuinely, there are a few things that the vampire counts don't have an answer for. To make things as general as possible to wrap up the pure rules positives, they are much like the Warriors of Chaos in a lot of ways, but I'd say with the extremes turned up even more. Properly supported, nothing is tankier than they are. Properly listed, nothing has more staying power and the ability to flood the field with chaff than them. Properly built, and your heroes are unstoppable monsters that can regenerate themselves even before some bozo with a skull on his waist waves his staff around and heals the vampires anyways. You've got regen saves out the ass, and though I've not mentioned it before, basically everything in your army causes fear, if not terror outright, and the entire thing is immune to psychology, because zombies and skeletons are scary, and you can't really scare a corpse puppeted by a magical string. Plus, it's nice to see the undead of Warhammer back in proper form. I like all the different death armies, but all the AOS ones tend to have a theme. The vampires and skeleton hordes are in one army, the ghouls are in another, etc., etc. The vampire counts were what they were when they were all mashed together, and it's a sight to behold and just as fun to play. And as for the legacy stuff, they're one of the finest showings of GW making an army, because the rules aren't just usable, they aren't just fine. Vampire Counts, an army who by virtue of legacy status don't get rules updates, keep winning tournaments. Until Cathay came out and was broken as shit, I think the legacy Vampire Counts were on top of the world. I'm not telling you to pick them because they're OP. If you do that, I think that's kinda shitty to be honest. This is instead some reassurance. Don't look at the legacy status and think that it's an army that plays like ass competitively. They're damn strong. It's only fitting, though, given whose notes created them. For after all, and say it with me now everyone, such is the power of Nagash. As for non-rules positives, building this army to look modern GW levels of quality is super easy. Just buy some Soulblight stuff, some Flesh Eater Court stuff, and you're good. This shouldn't be too difficult to fit on new old world bases, or at least the Soulblight stuff isn't, and if you want, you can probably substitute in some Ossiarch for Graveguard. They're a legacy army after all, no one can complain since that's what you got to work with at present. So if you want to flex on someone by having an army that technically doesn't have purchasable models be the best looking one on the field, they're great for it. Quite the barrage of rules there, so let's tone things down and talk some shit. No one likes vampires in Warhammer. The most almost any of them will get is grudging tolerance, such as Ulrika. That means even if you make your super special good guy vampire, chances are the only part of that description anyone in-universe is going to hear is vampire, and break out the stakes anyways. With good reason too, since while vampirism doesn't inherently change you, it tends to force you down a dark path by its nature. Once you realize you need to drink blood to survive, that kinda puts you in a position where it's very difficult to treat most people as anything but prey. It can be played tragically, but at the end of the day, that's how it's likely to be. Don't expect anyone else to see you come fight even greenskins or the forces of chaos with your undead hordes and be thankful for it. They'll just realign the sights on their cannons in your direction when you're done. They're also full of Starscream level infighting. They're always scheming and moving forward in a way I don't think even chaos by and large does, but that's so often amongst each other that they're fighting. Manfred basically set up Conrad von Carstein to fail and get himself killed. Now the Lamians do it so often that they're arguably behind most actions mortals take against vampires when they reveal the presence of a non-Lamian vampire to witch hunters or some equivalent. Aside from it being rather unproductive on a factional level, it also means that even with your own goddamn ranks, you can't sleep with both eyes closed. Your Vampire Thrall lesser hero options are probably just waiting for the right time to jump your count. Most of your forces are also going to have zero agency, which is a shame for all that the endless hordes of zombies are one of my favorite horror things out there. Undead in Warhammer are for the most part arguably not even true undead, but rather puppets filled with necromantic energy being marched in unison by their masters. That's why whenever a vampire count gets sufficiently powerful, they start recruiting necromancers, because otherwise even their might can't puppet all their forces. There's no hopes and dreams for most of what's in your army, because even ignoring the zombies, a lot of what's left is bestial vampires who've given into their thirst, or ghouls who are so inundated in necromantic magic they count as undead. Your vampires make up for it by having hopes, dreams, and ambitions beyond most anyone else in the setting, but John Zombie isn't going home to his undead wife to talk about their dream of retiring one day or anything like that. There's also the ever so slight issue that, even ignoring the end times, your entire army lives in perpetual fear of the return of the Skelepope himself. Manfred planned on bringing back Nagash only because he thought he could steal his power right as the ritual was finishing, and the moment Nagash came back, he had a profound realization of how insignificant he was compared to the great Necromancer. When Nagash did return in the end times, there was another vampire wizard who, prior to his return, was being built up as more or less Nagash 2.0. Nagash told him to serve, the vampire refused, whereupon Nagash set his brain on fire from across the world. Sucks to suck. You may be arguably the greatest threat to chaos and everyone else, but your greatest threat in turn is your boss showing back up to work. Fun fact, all of the vampiric weaknesses came about in Warhammer because of Nagash cursing the vampires for failing/abandoning him. He's a prick like that. And lastly, because vampire counts are cool, so this is a short con section, is that threatening as you are mostly limited to Sylvania. The vampire counts tends to refer specifically to those in Sylvania, even if the army lets you take upgrades to fluff them as a I von Carstein. This is arguably the reason they haven't taken over everyone else yet, because the moment you leave the shithole province, everyone else immediately breaks out the knives before a sizable vampire presence can be formed outside of Sylvania. Given how small that region is relative to the rest of the world, the vampires are absolutely punching above their weight class with great success, but I'm guessing GW was for once aware of some of the implications they had. They knew the vampires could snowball, and so they gave them the smallest power base out of all the major factions in lore, at least for factions that care about having that kind of thing. It does mean, as a last-minute lore positive, you can happily reap the rewards of being both the strongest guy around and being the underdog, but even your army has some handicaps for itself in the lore, even ignoring the whole "the sun kills you" thing. I would like to start this section by really making sure you understand just how shit your basic troops are. Zombies and skeletons have a weapon skill of 2. They're not going to be hitting very often. Statistically, it'll happen eventually, but I would not advise you using them as your main way of wounding, even if you take 1,000 of the things. You'll be sad when nothing happens. Since you can field so many of them, it's not even necessarily a problem of them being deployed poorly means you'll lose if your chaff is used wrong. You'll just feel stupid. What can go wrong is your characters, who are quite varied in how problematic they can be if you mess up. First off is the simplest stuff. Since you can sink so many points into your vampires between powers and magical items, you can rack up quite the tab for just a single guy. Especially given I don't think there's a limit to how many powers you can put on a single vampire other than the point cost limit for powers. By all means, you can make Lord Throngler the Destroyer, and he will in fact destroy most things he makes contact with handily. But that means you might not have many points left for anything but your various chaff models. So if you go all in on that, you might be left with nothing but zombies who can barely wound goblins reliably. And obviously, if Lord Throngler dies, you're the one who will get Throngled, unless he's already taken out half the enemy army's worth of points in turn. But it gets worse. For you see, when a vampire count general dies, that means the guy holding the army together has died. All those supporting necromancers I was talking about are just that, supporting the army. If your leader dies, your army is soon to follow because every unit starts taking leadership tests based on their own leadership and loses as many models as they fail the test by. Zombies have a leadership of 2. You'll be failing that test and probably by a lot. This rule, funnily enough, also had the insane side effect of making it a bad idea to make a vampire your general. Let me explain. Vampires, even the wizard ones, are best suited for melee combat. That's what the stats support. In order to make one a wizard, you have to pay for it. And to make one a properly powerful wizard that still caps out at level 3 only, you need a vampiric power. If you do this, you'll also need to give him the arcane armor that can be worn by wizards, because if not, your vampire will not have armor because he's a wizard, and therefore can't have armor. But say you do this. You have your vampire general, you made him a wizard, you gave him the armor. Great. You've made it so your melee monster is also a spellcaster, and so is never going to be fully effective as you have to choose between stabbing or spellcasting. And your melee monster will be in the thick of combat and might get killed. If he does get killed by being where he's supposed to be, up front and center, your army falls apart at the seams. If you want a vampire general, you need to make him a wizard, by the way, since your general always needs to be a wizard and you have to pay for the privilege. It doesn't need to be your highest level wizard, but it has to be a wizard. Making a vampire the official leader of your vampire count's army instead of a necromancer has somehow become a tall ask because of this. As a way around this, you might think I'll just bring a single level 1 necromancer and make him the general before putting him in a corner the whole match and not having any other wizards. You'll have all the points in the world for Lord Throngler then. Not the worst idea, but do be aware of how that'll affect your army's playing. Aside from this meaning you only have one spellcaster who is shit at casting spells, you've also put the largest kick me sign in history on that poor fella's back. One properly placed cannonball, one flanking maneuver you couldn't handle, and bam, instant army loss. Plus, to some extent, you really do need your necromancers. I didn't say spam them only because I like necromancers. Without them, your zombies go from an annoyance that won't die to simply an annoyance. If you aren't supporting your units, you're going to either find your chaff withering away in 2 turns tops, or those pricier fellows like Graveguard you paid a pretty penny for not doing nearly what you'd hope they would. This army, even including the zombies, is quite tanky between the resurrection and regen saves, but without both of those components, they don't have as much staying power as they otherwise do. This all also means that your opponent knows exactly how to make your army break, and if they can jump enough necromancers or the right one, your army will falter. Positioning your chaff correctly is easy because you have so much of it. Making sure the guy they're chaff for doesn't get murdered is a bit more important than that, and harder to pull off, if only a bit. Oh, and speaking of, if your general gets sniped, your army doesn't have their regen saves anymore. So yeah, make him a decently protected character, have spares, and for the love of God, unless you're running a pure lore-based list, just make a necromancer your general. Vampire generals would be great fun for a narrative-based game between you and a buddy, but if you're going somewhere with the intention to win, don't do that. And a bit similar to the Warriors of Chaos is that depending on what route you go on to go down, you might lock yourself out of having enough points for something else. Blood Dragons are awesome, and you should take them, but they're quite pricey, so you might not have room to make for a turbo vampire lord. Same for your various monsters and ghost units. Hex Wraiths are brutal because of Ethereal and because Ghost Cavalry is as awesome as it sounds, but you're paying for that keyword dearly. Plus, the moment someone breaks out magical weapons on them, especially ranged ones, they're gonna fade into the breeze. Avoid fighting Sisters of Avalorn like the plague with them if you can. As for the last few generalities to end on for tabletop cons, your army is undead and therefore pretty slow. There are ways to mitigate it, such as a good amount of units with the fly keyword, the dead wolves, and some spells, but by and large you aren't going anywhere fast. This is the most important thing about positioning them, though again, I suppose a blob of 100 zombies will ensure positioning is rather less than important for most of the models in your army. At that point, the game goes from make sure I have units in the right places to make sure I can get my actually good units through my horde of garbage. Your range game also basically doesn't exist. Again, similar to the Warriors of Chaos, if you want to force a ranged game so bad you're spamming zombie dragons for the breath attack and banshees for the yell attack, just play another army. You gotta get in there and hit hard, which admittedly isn't a problem for you when you do, but it does also make you a little bit predictable. Lord Throngler's presence will be taken into account by your opponent, even though if you play him right, all your opponent can really do is pray you roll nothing but ones to hit and wound. And lastly, I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the problems with them being a legacy army. You aren't really officially supported beyond the current list that you have. This means no new units ever coming and infrequent, if any, rules updates, which is less impactful for you since the army is solid. And all the models for this army also technically don't exist. That's why you gotta go AOS or secondhand. I would say on that point, however, that they're one of the more likely candidates to come out of Legacy, since by this point most of the old fantasy models GW used for AOS that were vampire counts originally have been updated, so they might bring back those old ones eventually. But for now, none of that. Legacy is also presumably the reason why there isn't a single named character in your army list, even if you can kind of build someone like Vlad through honors and magic item choices. A fine idea. I'd rather just have Vlad, though. And that was the Vampire Counts. Ride forth, scion of the von Carsteins, and show the Sigmarites that just because you're a legacy army doesn't mean they're going to become anything but another shambling corpse in your endless horde. Thank you as always to my wonderful channel members. You are the Graveguard to my Vampire Counts, those few skeletons standing taller than the rest of the hordes following behind. If you'd like to support the channel, feel free to subscribe or become a member. Either way, thank you for watching and take care out there. Something something Vladdy Daddy, something something Isabella is hot, something something out of pocket sex joke. I'm tired. I'm so very tired right now. The kind of tired sleep can't fix. Yeah, bet you regret sticking around till the end now, don't you? Welcome to my impromptu public therapy session. Population me and you, viewer.